Welcome, finally, to the last episode of my Every Empire series. This episode, we will cover history starting from the French Revolution until today, while also looking a tiny bit into what may be some empires of the future. Now, as always, an empire in this series counts as large and influential within their own region, though by this point, most empires will start having massive influence across the globe. This is the map of empires that we ended last video with. Britain had defeated France, and France had helped the Americans gain independence. Now, France was struggling with revolutionary activity, leading to several coalitions trying and failing to contain said revolution. This was partially because the French had a brilliant general called Napoleon, allowing them to expand despite fighting most of Europe. Napoleon would eventually seize power in France, while continuing to expand his influence, even declaring himself emperor. He would march into Central Europe, conquer Italy, conquer southern Germany, while in the process finally destroying the millennia-old Holy Roman Empire, before continuing to conquer even more of Germany and subjugate Spain, even if only temporarily. His empire would peak looking something like this, with France and puppets controlling most of Europe. But Napoleon would soon lose it all. Britain, his greatest opponent, helped Spanish guerrillas provide pressure on the French south. Meanwhile, his army had launched an invasion of Russia, which would turn into a disaster, as 90% of the invading army died the winter in Russian harassment. As the Russians defeated Napoleon, a final coalition would form against him, which would manage to defeat the emperor, leaving Europe to be reshaped. Some of our familiar empires would greatly benefit. Russia would expand massively, Austria's borders were restored and expanded with puppets in Italy. Britain regained Hanover, but more importantly, gained Sri Lanka and South Africa from the Dutch. Most interestingly though, France returned to the map in quite the same shape that they had before the war, despite arguably losing the biggest conflict in European history up to this point. But two empires didn't benefit from Napoleon's actions: Spain and Portugal. Let's update the map of the Americas. You see, the conflicts in Iberia have ensured that Spain couldn't stop nationalist revolts across their colonies. One by one, the Spanish Empire began breaking away, until we can no longer really consider the Spanish as an influential empire at all. Initially, it appeared like Gran Colombia might become a South American empire in its own right, but before their statehood was properly secured, they would split into three, none strong enough to ever be considered an empire. Up north, the Mexican Empire seemingly had the potential to dominate the region, but again, internal weakness would prevent it from truly competing with their neighbors. The Portuguese had fled the Napoleonic conquest of the mainland by going to Brazil, as Brazil was elevated to an equal kingdom to Portugal itself. But the Portuguese prince, regent over Brazil, would declare independence from Portugal itself, and so the Brazilian Empire was born. By this point, while Portugal still has some holdings in Africa, we cannot really count Portugal as a serious empire anymore. Brazil would, initially, flex their might over the rest of Latin America, and they could have become the definitive South American power. But this was not to be. Brazil would fail to seriously capitalize upon their position, losing Uruguay, seeing the monarchy coup by a corrupt republic, plotting in a period of economic stagnation, and all in all, Brazil would only weaken as time went on, as their spot as an empire faded into the wind. With that, we take a detour to India, where the Maratha Confederacy used to dominate the peninsula. That is, until the British began to conquer the subcontinent. But were it really the British? Not quite. It was the British East India Company, a private company subjected to Britain, which conquered and governed India with little oversight. This resulted in a ruthless regime, as the only thing the governors cared about was maximizing profits for shareholders. Famines and extreme struggle became normal for the common Indian, which would eventually culminate in the Sepoy Mutiny in India. This would result in company rule finally being abolished, as the British now took more direct control over India themselves, resulting in a slightly less horrific regime. During this time, the British had also found another hobby, trading with the Qing, which was still one of the wealthiest nations on earth. But small problem, the Qing didn't really want anything that Britain had to offer. Solution: get China addicted to opium. British India was put to work growing the addictive drug, which British traders would then bring to China, making Britain one of the largest organized drug cartels in history. When the Qing attempted to crack down on this drug trade, Britain would go to war, embarrassing the Chinese armies and navies, forcing the Qing to increasingly open up to British trade. This would further accelerate the decline of the Qing, as especially Russia began eating away at their external border. But it was about to get even worse. Despite many ups and downs, China across this series has always been the most powerful state in Asia. But while the Qing were in decline, the Americans had forced the Japanese to open up to the West. Many in Japan realized the need to modernize to keep up, kickstarting Japanese industrialization and militarization. Ready to prove themselves, the Japanese won a war against the Qing, marking arguably the first time in history the Chinese were no longer the dominant East Asian power. While Europe would force Japan to retreat from many of their gains, the message was clear. Japan as an Asian great power was here to stay. And they weren't done. In a major upset, Japan would then manage to defeat Russia, gaining control over Korea in the process. We shall return to this growing Japanese empire later. Now these defeats have further weakened and humiliated the Qing, eventually resulting in a Republican revolution, one that would result in the fall of the Qing into a Chinese republic. But even more drastically, as China fell into a warlord era, possibly for the first time in this series, no strong enough Chinese regime exists to be called an empire. Russia then had spent the era growing increasingly large, as they conquered Central Asia and were in constant wars against the Ottoman Empire. Yet, despite its size, it was starting to lag behind Europe, as they were slow and lacking in modernization. Their loss against Japan further exposed this weakness, and serious questions were raised about the future of the Russian Tsardom. On the other side of the world then, we have the Americans. After achieving independence, they have started spreading far west, but after a war with Mexico and a border agreement with Britain, their modern mainland borders become clear. Following this, the United States had a civil war over the future of slavery, resulting in the abolition of the practice. In the later half of the 19th century, millions of European immigrants came to the nation, leading to a massive economic boom for the US, slowly making it the most industrially powerful nation on Earth. They would push their might by taking Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines from the Spanish, while also having bought Alaska from Russia. But despite this being the largest the US will ever be territorially, we are nowhere near their peak in power. Elsewhere, we have the Ottomans. By the start of this video's time period, it was still somewhat powerful, despite having seriously started their decline. But arguably, their true collapse would begin due to Egypt, one of the most important provinces of the empire, as it came under control of Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali would consolidate control over the southern Ottoman Empire, officially still as a vassal, but in practice nearly independent. Ali would then strike deep into the Levant, threatening to topple the Ottoman Empire fully. It would require the intervention of the European great powers to get Muhammad Ali to back down, saving the Ottoman Empire for now. But Ottoman issues weren't gone. An increase of nationalism in the Balkan would see a slow decline of territory there, while losing Tunis to France and Libya to Italy. Eventually, the rest of the Balkan would break away as well, leaving them a shell of their former selves. But their full collapse will have to wait a little bit. Back to Egypt, the now practically independent state would strike south, conquering Sudan as well. From this position though, the Egyptians would start to decline, as the British crept in to increasingly dominate the nation, ending the short Egyptian stint as a potential empire. We then return to Europe, where in the absence of the HRE, the German Confederation was set up, with Austria as its most powerful state, much to the dismay of Prussia, the rising star of the region. Now by this point, I don't consider Prussia strong enough to be an empire yet, but in 1866, the Prussians would come into conflict with the Austrians, defeating them handily and forming the North German Confederation, kicking Austria out of German politics. At the same time, the rising Sardinia-Piedmont had kicked Austria out of Italy, though I consider Italy an almost empire, as I do think that they are fundamentally weaker than all the other European empires. Anyways, after defeating Austria, Prussia then turned to France, conquering Alsace-Lorraine and forming the German Empire, quickly becoming, arguably, the most powerful European state. With our European empires established, they then decided to carve up the African continent. France got most of the West, Germany carved out several colonies, while Britain arguably gained the most. Moving on to Asia, the Europeans consolidated control here too. As we zoom out, these are the empires as we enter World War I. And, completely unprecedented in this series, most of the world is under control of one empire or another. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. But the biggest war of all time was about to break out. Germany, Austria and the Ottomans would form the Central Powers, while France, Britain and Russia formed the Entente. Other nations were also involved, but they aren't empires and so legally don't matter in this series. During this war, the German Empire had their territorial peak, as the Russians collapsed into a civil war, briefly removing them from the empire's list. But despite this Eastern victory, Germany would start to struggle on the other fronts. Worst of all, America had joined the war, the death nail to any hope of a Central Powers victory. The Ottomans were the first to collapse under the pressure, reforming into Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Next, the Austro-Hungarian Empire would collapse due to internal revolt. Germany could no longer hope for a military victory, and they too surrendered, being stripped from territories and briefly disappearing as an empire. In one war, 4 European empires had bitten the dust. Territorially, France and Britain benefited greatly. They partitioned Africa again while increasing control over the Middle East, a territorial peak for both the French and the British empires, as by this point, Britain controlled 25% of the world's population and landmass. The Americans would have a major economic boost after the conflict, as America, without a doubt, became the most powerful economy and arguably nation on Earth. The economy is doing great, and I'm sure it will do so forever. Japan expanded into some Pacific islands and looks increasingly set to dominate China. Russia, after suffering through a civil war, returned to the empire scene rebranded as the Communist Soviet Union under Stalin's leadership, during which period, at the cost of much human suffering, Russia finally became a powerful industrial powerhouse. These were the 5 empires when the Great Depression hit the world. In Germany, this economic downturn would facilitate the rise of an extreme nationalist regime, set to return Germany to the table as a great power. Over in Asia, the military would increasingly seize control over Japan, launching an invasion of Manchuria, followed by a larger invasion of all of China. The Germans are militarizing fast, while uniting with Austria, invading Czechoslovakia, and setting up a major German state at the heart of Europe. But, not being content, Germany and the Soviets begin major expansion campaigns, as Germany conquers Western Europe, securing the Balkan, and peaking after an invasion of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile in Asia, Japan had grabbed Indochina before launching a surprise conquest of most of Southeast Asia. This would be the peak of Axis power, but it's all going downhill from here. Focusing on Germany, the Western Allies would win the battle for Africa, while the Soviets regrouped and pushed back the Germans too. Then, invasions of Italy and France would see the Germans soon defeated by the Allied powers. Back to Japan, they now became the focus for the Allies. Following losses on the battlefield and 2 nuclear weapons, the Japanese too collapsed. Much like World War I, World War II would be the death of 4 empires. First, Germany and Japan, obviously, but also France. After having been occupied, they lost their global relevance, while starting to lose colonies like Syria and Indochina. Over the next few decades, France would slowly decline further and further as a global power. Britain faced the same fate. In 1945, when the war ended, they were still a superpower, but in the years following, they lost India, their most important colony, as well as Egypt. The dominions of Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and Australia that over the past century began acting more and more like independent states. A nice pinpoint for the end of Britain as a true empire is the Suez Crisis of 1956, where Britain, France, and Israel attempted to reclaim control over the Suez Canal, only for the Soviets and Americans to force them to back down. Wherever you put the date, the British would stop being an empire somewhere during the Cold War. We have now reached an unprecedented period in history, as only 2 powers remain: the capitalist America and the communist Soviet Union. The Soviets held forceful military control over several states in Eastern Europe, while attempting to spread communism across the world by various dubious means. The Americans had a more willing relationship with Western Europe, but especially in Latin America, the Americans too acted like ruthless hegemons, not opposed to deposing any leaders that they didn't like. Now it is pretty tough to show these empires on a map. Technically, this was the peak of global communism, but unlike Eastern Europe, the Soviets didn't dominate most of these states. Similarly, the US had this massive alliance bloc across the world, but for the most part, they were sovereign and free to leave whenever they wanted. So, for the sake of this video, I'll leave just their maps with direct puppets and control. After 5 decades of competition between the 2 powers, the Soviets began to feel the pressure more. As they were struggling economically, a war in Afghanistan had turned sour, and the US was more successful at getting other nations to join their side. Eventually, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev would try to open up the Soviet economy and political system, which would be the opportunity the people of the Eastern Bloc needed to destroy the Soviet Union altogether. This meant that just for a brief decade, the United States stood as the only empire in the world, acting as the world police with little to no opposition. But after the 9/11 attacks and invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, America would start to grow weary of foreign intervention, just as some other powers are rising in power. By my definition, 4 empires exist in the modern day. The first is America, obviously. The second is the European Union. This may be a bit controversial, but the Union has either the second or third largest economy in the world, with major influence not just on their continent, but also globally. Still, the Union is very new and riddled with issues. Migrant and currency crises, Britain leaving the bloc, wars on the continent, they are all testing the Union. Still, as it stands today, the EU qualifies as an empire. Then to the east, from the ashes of the Soviet Union, Putin has attempted to salvage a Russian empire. It is by far the weakest of the 4 today, and I doubt it will survive as an empire until 2050. But, as it stands, it is a powerful nation and military, fighting hard to try and remain relevant in the post-Soviet sphere. Then, our final modern empire, the Chinese state, starting to be an empire again around the 2000s. Thanks to the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese economy has become the fastest growing major economy in history, pulling China back to the forefront of global relevance. China is immensely powerful, attempting to unite the developing world under their hegemony, while being immensely interested in reclaiming the island of Taiwan. Still, not all is well. Especially in recent years, the Chinese economic rise has begun to slow, while an increasing number of old people and decreasing number of working age people has only decreased fears that China will eclipse the US as the #1 great power. While I doubt that they'll ever disappear from the great powers list in this century, I also highly doubt that China will come to dominate the world anytime soon. To conclude the series, let's make a list of potential great powers by, let's say, 2100. First, I definitely think that Russia is dropping off. Their declining population is a major issue, but them invading a neighbor, seeing more young men die, and causing international isolation, that's just not a great move. The nation perhaps most likely to join the rankings is India. While they have a lot of issues, they have a population of 1.6 billion, good education, and a rising economy. The question is mostly, will India ever become the next China, or will they remain just a relatively powerful state in the region? Another nation with great potential is Indonesia. Current projections suggest that, with a young and growing population, they might even come close to the US economy by 2100. Of course, a lot depends on how well they manage their current growth, but the potential is there for sure. Another nation with great potential, which I am less optimistic about, is Brazil. On paper, they should have already been a great power by now, but mismanagement has prevented them from reaching this potential. With an aging population, I do indeed fear that it is now too late for them. Then finally, and these I consider unlikely but plausible empires, is Nigeria. Their population is rising insanely fast, and should they manage to invest their oil wealth into sustainable development, they could become a miniature version of China, at least the most powerful state in Africa. Another contender for this title though would be the East African Federation, a great plan to unite 6 East African states into one. Yet, in recent years, my optimism for the proposal has dropped significantly, when South Sudan and the Congo, 2 of the most unstable nations on earth, were allowed in as well, with even Somalia seemingly welcomed to join. Still, if anything close to this becomes a reality, the potential wouldn't be lost on anyone. A massive, growing young population, access to the rich resources of Africa. If they can combat corruption and start growing sustainably, this could definitely be a powerhouse in the making, with their federal nature offering the potential to keep adding nations to the Union, further spreading their wealth. But anyways, that's all in the future. For now, this series is finally done. Here is a map of all empires in this final episode. Now, truly, most of the world has at some point been touched by an empire. It is also very clear that this final episode had a huge focus on Europe, as the continent shines very bright compared to the rest. For now though, I will thank you all for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.